It is now my pleasure to turn today's program over to Dr. Peter Hurst, Associate Dean, MIT Sloan Executive Education. Dr. Hurst, the floor is yours.
Thank you, William. Hello, everybody. Greetings from the MIT Sloan School of Management. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. We have over 3,500 people from all over the world registered for today's webinar. And I'm very excited to be joined here by Professor John Van Maanen, who is the Irwin Shell Professor of Management and a Professor of Organization Studies at the MIT Sloan School of Management. The Innovation at Work webinar series, this is our 19th now, and this series brings the latest insights from our world-renowned faculty here at the Sloan School. And the webinars feature current research from professors and lecturers who teach, particularly in our executive education programs. And Professor Van Maanen is a veteran of our executive education programs, has taught in many open enrollment and custom programs for clients and participants from all around the world, including the Greater Boston Executive Program, which we're very proud to be running here in Boston. More on that later. Professor Van Maanen is renowned the world over for his research in ethnographics. He has studied all kinds of organizations in the public sector, the private sector. His research and writings are extremely highly regarded, and we're very proud of him here at the MIT Sloan School. Once again, we're going to have a very exciting hour or so now with Professor John Van Maanen talking about three perspectives on organizational change. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Professor John Van Maanen. John, take it away.
Thank you, Peter. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the audience. I'm thrilled to be here. I want to start out with a little exercise. I want you to tell me what I'm drawing, okay? To use your imagination a bit. That looks like an egg, I suppose. Put a donut maybe? Maybe a target, could perhaps be a target. Put some legs on it. Looks like a insect, a bug maybe. Breathing apparatus. Well, that could be a mouse. What could that be? Oh, eyes. I see. And ears. It's beginning to look like a pig. A pig. Yes, it is. Maybe even a piggy bank. The point of this is that it's a perspective. You have to put a perspective on this to understand what the pig may symbolize. If you were a hunter, for example, what would you see? Maybe game, something to shoot. If you were a butcher, what might you see? Money. If you were a farmer, you would see money, perhaps. If you were a feminist, what might you see? Male chauvinist. If you were a Muslim, what do you see? Probably something untoward, unclean. If you were a little kid, what would you see? Cartoon character. The point of all this is that it's a perspective. You have to apply a perspective. The pig and the squibbles of the lines that I've drawn don't announce their meaning, but you provide a perspective, and you do it largely unthinking, without thinking about it. Perspectives are a way of understanding organizations. It's a metaphor. It's a system of understanding. They determine the data you see, you hear, you feel, the questions you ask, where your attention lies. They determine how we interpret the data we see. The drawing of the pig doesn't announce itself. And the banal point is that there's no single perspective that's adequate to view an organization or an organization change. You have to use multiple perspectives. And as I go through this presentation, I'd like you to think about the perspective you automatically apply, usually without thinking, when there's an organizational problem, an organizational issue that exists. How do you diagnose it? How do you see it? That also determines what you will see as a possible solution. I want to broaden the perspectives that you have available in today's one-hour talk as best I can. So let's think of three perspectives. One of them is strategic design. I will label it strategic design. It's clearly the most popular, the most familiar. I suspect you don't have to think very much about it. But action comes through planning. This is a perspective that believes there is a universal rationality at work in the world. That is, there are right answers, right ways to do things. Organizations, if they're designed correctly, are basically machines that get input, throughput, and produce output. And if they're designed well, it's the output you wanted. It's a mechanical system. One looks at the way it operates, one looks at the environment, sees the challenges and the opportunities that are out there, maybe through an economic analysis or strategic analysis. And then once that is known, what the environment is like, the organization is designed to take advantage of it. And it is structured in such a way that optimizes the organizational output. This is a big brain theory of organizations. It says that we know enough about organizational processes, organizational structure, that we can design it correctly. And it's very future-oriented. It tells us what we want to do tomorrow, next week, next quarter, next year. So rationality is built into it. It is a big brain theory of organizations. You really can see these mostly by contrast. Another way of seeing organizations, viewing it, is that action doesn't come through planning. Action comes through power. Power is the ability to get things done. Nothing more, nothing less. But action comes through power. Organizations really are contests. There isn't such a thing as a universal rationality. Rationality depends on where you sit. If you sit in a marketing group, you see a certain organization. You sit in manufacturing, you see a different organization. If you sit in R&D, you see a different organization. We are limited. We have limited rationality or bounded rationality. Rationality is not universal. It depends on where you sit. An organization, then, is a social system, but it's a conflictual system. Everybody wants power, the ability to get things done, but power is not shared equally. This is a very different view of organizations from strategic design, which depends on universal rationality. There is a third perspective, cultural. This is a perspective that in some sense says there just isn't that much rationality in the world. We're not rational creatures. We're basically creatures of habit. We do things in a certain way that have worked for us in the past, and as long as they continue to work, we continue to do them. Organizations are symbolic systems of meanings, of values, of routines, of informal norms, traditions, some of it unsaid. Action comes through habits built upon tradition and the past. Strategic design is about the future. Political perspective is about the present, who can get things done now. Cultural is, in some sense, based upon the past. What have we done that has worked for us in the past? So those are the three perspectives. I'm going to then walk you through each one of them, tell you how they work. It's a diagnostic procedure, and it's got to be done well because it will determine the success of organizational change efforts. It must be aligned, strategic design, political, and cultural, to get anything done, to make change successful. But first of all, it will depend upon a good diagnostic process. You can color code our perspectives. We think of strategic design, it's sort of a blue perspective, cool, blue, rational, action coming through planning. The political perspective is red, blood red, as a matter of fact. You might ask yourself, well, why is it red? Well, kind of blood on concrete, contest, fighting, battles, action coming through power. The cultural perspective, there it is. It's white. Why is it white? Well, I put a little color in here. It's white because you can't see it. It's invisible. And partly the power of culture is that it is invisible. As long as habits continue to work, they are invisible, unseen. When they stop working, it changes things. So that's an overview, a 50,000-foot view of these three perspectives. I'm going to overemphasize the difference between them. At the end, I'll try to put them together a little bit. But we'll look at each one individually and see its positive and its negative effects. We'll start with strategic design. This is the highly rational, using various concepts. The key concepts are essentially structural attributes. How you group people in an organization, how they are linked, because certain groups have to talk to other groups, and how they are aligned, that is, how they are motivated to keep doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that's matched with a fourth variable, which is fit, the external environment. Are you meeting your goals? The environment is seen as opportunities and threats. You analyze it with a Porterian five forces analysis, or any other variety of strategic approaches. And once that environment is diagnosed, the organization is put into play and organized such that the opportunities can be taken advantage of and the threats minimized. The role of the leader is a very positive, flattering, if you will, role. It's the architect, the designer of the organization, the strategist who makes great sense and invents ways of doing things. The stimulus for change, of course, is the lack of fit between the environment and the organization. You're not meeting your goals. The barrier to change is not having enough intelligence, inadequate analysis, inadequate information. So it's a mechanical system that operates in a particular way. If we look at the key variables, the key concepts, how people are grouped, how people are linked, the alignment mechanism, and then it is the bottom line is how it fits with the external environment. Is it working? As long as it's working, there's no need to reorganize, restructure the organization. Looking at the strategic design grouping criteria, how are people grouped? What are the clusters? Interdependent activities that go together. There's only a few ways to group. You can group by function, by activity, what people do. You can group by the specific business it is, or you can group by the market, the customer, geography. Of course, in most organizations, they're complex these days, we group by all three measures. So you report to your functional manager and your business manager and your market manager, maybe a dotted line or a heavy line. And we have all kinds of hybrids, matrix organizations. Front end is organized in a particular way. The back end is organized differently. I don't think I have to go into this. These are sort of familiar processes. So the grouping is a key part of the strategic design, as is linking. How do you get groups that have to talk and have to coordinate their activities? How do you get them to do so? Well, you have the formal reporting structure, the organization structure as it is drawn out in the organization chart. Usually that is inadequate. You've got to have other ways of ensuring coordination, such as liaison roles, such as integrator roles, cross-unit grouping, temporary cross-grouping, the IT system that you have, the shared database, the CAD tools, the planning and budgeting system, variety of linking mechanisms. If they're all working, then the parts of the organization that need to communicate with other parts of the organization do so. It all works very smoothly, except when it doesn't. The third mechanism, the third attribute of strategic design are the alignment mechanisms that you have in place. This is to make sure that the people have the resources and the motivation to carry out the activities that are given to them. So of most importance probably are the performance metrics that you use. What are your KPIs? How are people meeting them? Tied to that are certain rewards and incentives. The resource allocation procedures at large in the organization, HR policies, how do you recruit, train, track, promote, plan, and informal systems, who sits next to each other, how is the geography of the organization produced. That's alignment. It is very complicated. We never get it perfect. We are trying to constantly shift the performance metrics and the rewards associated with them. But in principle, there's a kind of loop here, sort of Ferris wheel in the strategic design process. In some sense, it starts with the senior managers establishing the strategy out in the woods, perhaps with their consultants, but they say, okay, this is our strategy, this is where we're going, this is where our organization needs to be, and then that begins the deciding who does what. How do you group people? Who's going to allocate the activities to certain units? What groups are important? What groups are less important? And then you've got to worry about linking, how we get the cross-unit coordination. And then we've got to worry about the aligning mechanisms, make sure that everybody is doing what they're supposed to do. And then we check in the environment whether there's a fit or not. What does that mean? It means whether you're hitting your targets or not. If you're not, whoops, there's something wrong. Either the strategy is misplaced, bad strategy, or the strategy is okay, but the design of the organization is not okay. So you can imagine that on this process, you're constantly tinkering with the strategy, constantly tinkering with the linking, aligning, grouping mechanisms. And that's the way strategic design operates. Probably 90% of what we teach in business schools is strategic design. The conceit is that if you have this down, you know all the mechanisms and the normative theory of organization, you can do this correctly. experience would suggest that it is not always done so well. If you think about grouping, here's a little cartoon from the Wall Street Journal. Newgate, you report to Cunningham, who reports to me. I, in one of those inexplicable paradoxes of the business world, report to you. So we don't always get the grouping right. Well, I don't think we get linking right either. This is a cartoon that doesn't need an explanation. I sometimes think that's my office in the middle. And on the aligning mechanisms, we wouldn't have Scott Adams if we always got aligning correctly. The boss says, well, our goal is to write bug-free software. I'll pay a $10 bonus for every bug you find and fix. Software engineers go bananas. Yahoo, we're rich. The coolest boss says, well, I hope this drives the right behavior. And Wally, who's a software engineer, looks at him and says, well, I'm going to write me a new minivan this afternoon. So strategic design has a lot of difficulties implementing. The universal rationality assumption is probably a poor assumption. And we look to other perspectives to begin to explain it. The bloody perspective that an organization is made up of conflicting groups, all vying for the resources that they need. They all think they have the best interests of the organization at large in mind, but they have different amounts of power and influence. Their networks are different. Their interests are different. The view of the environment is not opportunities and threats. The environment is stakeholders. There are people out there that want something from the organization. These may be customers. They may be other organizations. They may be regulators. Maybe the government. There are stakeholders that are demanding that the organization do certain things. The stakeholders differ in power, of course. The role of the leader is a different one. It's not a big brain who operates on the basis of models. It is a role of the leader who can diagnose the social fabric of the organization, can build coalitions, can identify and leverage interests, negotiate and resolve conflict, relate well to people. The role of the leader is somebody who can bring people together to get things done, has power, understands power, deals well with power. Stimulus for change doesn't happen unless the dominant coalition shifts. The power of the stakeholders shifts. If the customers are getting more and more power in the current era, then the power in the organization should shift, doesn't always, should shift to those who are in closest contact with the customer. The barrier to change, of course, are entrenched interests. Nobody wants to give up power voluntarily. We all have certain amounts of power. We all want more. Working with the political lens is rather different. You start by understanding who the key stakeholders are. Now, some of them will be internal to the organization, some will be external. Those who have a stake or an interest in what the organization does. Middle management, the workers, the regulators, government, stockholders, shareholders, the board, senior management, all different groups, all having different amounts of power. But being able to identify those stakeholders, and particularly identify those who are the most powerful, and to know what they want, their interests. You have to be aware of what it is. You may know the stakeholders, but do you know their interests? And then be able to negotiate, leverage those interests so that you reach what are sometimes mutually acceptable outcomes. And the key to working with the political lens is persuasion, being able to influence, bring on board. Do you have certain rewards that you can offer certain groups? the role the gift plays in the organization. This is a Machiavellian view of organizations, but it is realistic. Sources of power, we could do this from an organizational standpoint. We could do it from a collective standpoint. I'm going to just suggest the sources of power at the individual level. There are, of course, the role-based power, where you stand on the organization chart, the decision rights that you have, your abilities to reward and coerce. Sociologists would tell us that these role-based sources of power are perhaps less important than they once were, because to get anything done in an organization these days, you have to attract and bring on board people over whom you have no power, no formal power. It's your persuasive power. So other sources of power are personal. Your IQ, expertise, how much you know should count for something. Obviously, theoretically, this is gaining more importance as organizations become more complicated, as products and services become more sophisticated. Social bases of power. There is something called charisma. We don't know what it is. It's our magic seltzer, a Steve Jobs element. But it amounts to something. Some people study it. Emotional intelligence. So interests of late. People see that as the ability to empathize and the ability to understand what others' interests are, and just general personal attraction. This could be an infinite list. I threw up physical stamina because I happen to think it's rather important. The ability to stick to it, ability to be stubborn, demanding. I have a personal example of that. I was asked to go to Dubai a couple of years ago. The person that asked me was a colleague, had no formal authority over me. There's a fellow faculty member who was organizing this conference. And I said, no, I'm not going. I can't go. I don't want to take a week off to make this trip. I thought it was important, but it was not something I wanted to do. Well, this guy kept after me, called me, emailed me fairly consistently for the weeks preceding. I kept saying no. One day I was walking past his office, and he came out and put his arm around me and said, where are you going? I said, back to my office. And he said, well, I'll walk you back. It was across campus, and he walked me back and gave me the pitch about how important my presence was in Dubai at this conference. I was still saying no. We got to my building, the elevator, I'm waiting for the elevator, he's still with me. We jump in the elevator, he gets on. We go up to the third floor. I get out the elevator. I think I'm going to say goodbye. I walk to the men's room. He follows me into the men's room. Still giving me the pitch. Gotta come. Finally, I walk out of the men's room, go over to my office, get my keys out. I open the door. Some students are waiting for me, and he walks right in behind me. Says, you still going? And at that point, I said, yeah, I will go. Just get out of my office. It was just, this was important enough to him that the physical stamina of my participation was important enough to him. And physical stamina, I bet you all have examples of something like that. The last, we won't talk about much in this webinar, it is the structural sources of power, which are networks, both your own network, who you know, the quality of the relationship, the ties, the nature of the ties, weak or strong, but the knowledge of the landscape. You may not be central in a network, but if you know the network and know who's central, you gain a modicum of power from it. This structural source of power is of some importance these days, and there's a good deal of research that is about the networks and the use of networks. In the executive ed classes I run, we spend a lot of time on the network basis of power. Well, the power can be satirized as well. It's sort of a paranoid view of organizations. You often don't know who's powerful. It's an Iago to Othello, Steve Bannon to Donald Trump. Who's in charge? It's a bit invisible often. Here's another Scott Adams cartoon. It says the consultant says, you need a dashboard application to track your key metrics. That way you'll have more data to ignore when you make your decisions based on company politics. Clueless boss says, will the data be accurate? And the consultant says, pretend that matters. That's advice. This is pretty nice. We want to include you in the decision without letting you affect it. Pseudo power. Here's the one. So long, Ed, this is my floor. Guy's office takes up an entire floor. When I came to MIT years ago, I was told that you could tell somebody's power in the organization by simply counting the ceiling tiles in their office. And the one with the most tile had the most power. It was pretty good. It was pretty accurate. It no longer works because we have equal offices, but at the time it was good. Okay, the last perspective, probably the most complicated, the most difficult. Anthropologists say that culture is a bit like life is to a biologist, or God is to a theologian, or force is to a physicist. It's very complicated. Key concepts in analyzing an organization as a cultural system are the habits that people have adopted, the identities that they take. Do they see themselves as an accountant primarily and an organizational member secondly, or vice versa? The traditions that are built in, the shared mental models that they have for going about their business. It's about meaning, about interpretation. It's about what those squibbles that I began this talk with, what they mean. The social and cultural network. The role of the leader is to articulate a persuasive purpose, build and manage the culture. The challenges, stimuli, and change only come when the basic assumptions or the habits change. Then they are challenged. They no longer work. Contested interpretations, where groups within the organization battle for control of the organizational culture. Barriers to change, of course, are the dominant culture. Now, I won't go through this slide other than to say it is a complicated thing. I think the way culture is defined is the way things are done around here. You usually don't have to defend it. It is simply pointed out. I think Ed Schein's definition of culture gives you the best sense of what it means. Schein said that it was a set of basic assumptions that defines for us what to pay attention to, what things mean, how to react emotionally to what is going on, and what kind of actions to take in various kinds of situations. Key phrase in that is how to react emotionally to what's going on. When you wake up and go to work in the morning, what makes you happy? What makes you mad? You don't think about it. It happens. That's culture in operations. The cultural lens operating, one of the things that makes it so complicated is that we're all multicultural individuals. We have a country culture, a national culture. We have an industry culture that may in various ways vary. We live in organizations where our organizations, even if they're in the same industry, have unique value, our interests and assumptions. But of most relevance are perhaps the organization's subcultures that exist in organizations of any considerable size. The functional groups, the shared task groups. There is an engineering culture, there is a management culture, there is a finance culture. You put them in the same room, they don't see things the same way. Finance people are going to be worried about what things cost. The salespeople want to be getting things sold. Production people are going to be wanting to get them out the door. So separating the national, the industry, the organizational, and the subcultures out is complicated. It's hard to say which is in the abstract, which will be more important on a given problem. The given problem may suggest it's a subcultural conflict. A given problem may say, well, it's an industry-based culture. So it takes diagnostic savvy to work the organizational cultural lens. Culture changes. Culture that couldn't change will die. It doesn't exist any longer. Mayas, Aztecs sort of represent an example. So there's natural evolution. As the environment shifts, the culture shifts. Usually it's glacial in speed. There's lags built into it. We try to manage it in various ways by our organizational development and learning programs that is more or less can be more or less acceptable. I think if we talk about rapid cultural shift in organization, it comes about by the red zone at the bottom of this slide, from scandals, from highly charismatic leadership, a large infusion of outsiders into the organization. Mergers and acquisitions, there's probably no such thing as a merger. It's always an acquisition. Coercive persuasion, Chapter 13, self-destruction, turnarounds. That's when I think one looks at rapid cultural change. You can satirize this as well. This cartoon probably says it better than any analytic discussion of culture. Two guys wearing goofy hats. One guy says, I don't know how it started either. All I know, it's part of our corporate culture. Cartoon to me says, well, if one of those guys forgot the hat and came to the office, they'd go home and get it. They don't know how it started. It may started for a perfectly rational reason, to keep the rain off their face, help them identify one another in a crowd. But it's become so inbred in the organization, it's such a habit that it continues. This is a little more meaningful. Some guy, looks like an accountant, looking at a report, maybe a balance sheet. And one guy, and on one shoulder is the angel that says, run it by legal. And on the other shoulder is a devil saying, run it by accounting. My sense is that your culture tells you what to run it by. You don't even think about it. You know what to do in that particular case. Could be either way. That is three perspectives at a very rapid, a very quick pace. What we do in the executive programs we run here at Sloan is to work these through in some detail and by examples, by cases, reporting our research finding. Keywords are put up on this particular slide. One way of thinking about it, if you look at the MIT Sloan executive programs, including this webinar, you can manage to see it from 3 perspectives. Strategically, the webinar is make us smarter, to learn explicit organizational skills, to be able to diagnose organizations, to see change from 3 perspectives, make us smarter. Webinar is probably not the best at the political clout. It is an empowering device. Who is able to tune into it, a legitimizing strategy. But the face-to-face executive programs that we run, we can use those to intensify, broaden, change social networks, make us stronger, Or you can read it from a cultural perspective. Really what this webinar is about is to deepen, change, articulate, become aware of the mental models, the values, the habits that we have. What does it mean to be a modern manager in the 21st century? Providing a professional identity. Make us better. So, those are the 3 perspectives. It is time for question and answer, I think. I have one. You can't have a webinar from an MIT professor and not get a Venn diagram. It's absolutely required. It's built into the model. It's part of our habits. It is, of course, the case that an organization is made up of all 3 systems. The problems that you face are going to be in all 3 dimensions. They're going to be partly strategic. You've got to have the right organization to fit the particular problem. But it may not operate that way because the power doesn't sort itself out according to the strategic design. And the culture may resist in various ways. So you've got to be able to see it all together. Most problems are all a combination of all 3. But to operate effectively in your environment, you've got to see the difference. So the bottom line is, I hope you can see the benefits of seeing the organization out of the red and the white lens. I have found that the blue lens is the lens that gets the most discussion, and often the other levers are ignored. To operate in the red zone, who do you need to bring along? Who are the possible allies? Who are your opponents and your opposition? What can you offer them? And in the white area, the cultural area, don't think always of cultural change. What can you use about the culture that is useful for your initiative, for your change? What habits and presumptions do you have to overcome is also a question. So, let me stop and turn it back to Peter.
Thank you very much, John. We've been getting a lot of questions as Professor Van Maanen has been speaking. Please keep them coming. But let me start just by diving right into some of the themes that I've seen emerging from our participants in this webinar. First, just going back to the slide, we don't need to show it again, but you showed the Venn diagram with the interaction between the 3 lenses. That's leading a lot of questions around, is there, in the organizations you've studied, an optimal mix? Is an organization that's dominated by the political lens actually unhealthy, for example?
Well, I think that you find family organizations tend to be more political. The distance between the founder or the founder's clan determines one's power. That often creates a strategic liability. Some organizations are culturally dominated. The millennials, looking out here at Kendall Square over your shoulder, I think of organizations that there's no rule book, there's no structure, explicit. There's very much a culture that structures and provides relationships among people. No, I don't think there's an optimal one. I think we start out at the founding stage. The culture, the power, and the strategic design is in the image of the founder or the founding group. So they're aligned. But as you hire people and grow, then subcultures begin to develop. Power gets divided. And within those groups, over time, a generation or two generations, deep habits form, ways of doing things. Perfectly understandable because the organization is successful. Mm-hmm. Most organizations don't succeed. They're out of business before they've begun. Those that succeed have a vital interest in developing good habits that work. After 2 or 3 generations, it becomes taken for granted. Now that can lead to problems if the assumptions begin to shift. But I don't think at day one at founding, yes, you could say all are aligned, and that would be the, quote, perfect organization. But that rarely is kept.
Mm-hmm. So there are interactions, essentially.
There's interactions
between the perspectives. Yeah. We've clearly got a lot of people listening in and watching who are familiar with our work at MIT Sloan, and I'm asking about one of the things that we say when we think about systems thinking, that structure induces behavior, which you're very familiar with.
Yeah.
Have you got any thoughts or comments on sort of what the direction of flow is in terms of the impact of structure, for example, on politics or culture?
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting. I mean, one would like to say, and a textbook version would have it that structure induces a certain behavior. The strategic design divides up the power dimension and determines the culture. I think it works the other way around. I think once the culture has formed and shaped, then it selects who is going to have power. That's consistent with the culture. And those in power will choose a strategic design that suits them well, that suits their interests well. And it doesn't work in reverse. We would like to think it does work in reverse. We can just change the reward system and boom, behavior will shift. It doesn't work that way.
So this reminds me a little, and some people have been asking about this as well, of a recent finding from psychology and neuroscience science that we think we make rational decisions, but basically we make emotional decisions and then rationalize them with the data.
That's very much the case. That's very much the case. And that's sort of understandable from the cultural perspective. Mm-hmm. But what is mysterious about it, or seems mysterious, is that the culture is invisible. It's sort of like the air we breathe. Mm-hmm. And only when it's pointed out to us. Right. When we go to a different culture, I will travel to Mexico in 3 weeks. Well, then I'm very aware of being an American, very aware. But when I'm here, when I'm in the States, I don't even think about it. Don't even think about it. So it's a sort of mental shift to understand the workings.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is fascinating. We often hear the phrase culture eats strategy
first. Right.
But what I'm hearing you describe, in fact, is there may be that sort of
there's an interaction,
but also culture creates strategy.
That's true. It's very true. Yeah.
So how do you study organizations in a particular way? How does one set about making culture visible?
Well, it takes a long time. I spend years in an organization. I never stop learning. The holy grail of what I do, ethnography, is basically surprise. So I try to engage in as many conversations with people that are different than I am, sometimes spectacularly different, and I learn gradually, develop relationships, develop trust. I think it is very difficult to quickly absorb and learn a culture, which makes it so difficult because it is invisible. It talks about. It is implicit. You learn by making mistakes. In organizations, a lot of my suggestions are met with great appreciation, but I'm sorry, we cannot do this. And then discover why. It's chasing down the variance that exists within the culture is the essence of the ethnographic process. But it is, I just reviewed an interesting book called On the Run, Fugitive Life in Philadelphia by Alice Goffman. She spent 8 years in the neighborhood studying low-level drug dealers, and they live in the underground economy, but basically are hounded by the police for low-level warrants and arrests. She spent 8 years trying to figure out how this culture operates. It is unfortunately a culture of suspicion, distrust, unpredictability, a pretty discouraging culture. But 8 years to try to figure it out. She's got a beautiful portrait of it now. I am often asked into organizations, and they say, well, could you do a study of our culture? And how long would it take? And I will say, well, a year? I'm sorry, we don't have that kind of time. We have 6 weeks or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So the academic value of cultural study and the reality of it is quite different. So
it's interesting that you say that it would take a year.
Yeah.
We often think about the idea that culture takes a long time to form and a long time to change.
Right.
Are you seeing any trends, though? For example, just the new ways that organizations work.
I think that we have a new generation, millennials, that is very familiar with technology, for example, and the technology changed pretty rapidly. So I think one is seeing cultural change at that level. The new organizations that are coming in, the Googles, the Amazons that are operating on a fundamentally different platform, and from the organizations that we're more familiar with. Very few organizations last very long. I mean, it's a handful of organizations that have been around for 50 years or 100 years. So this is not unusual. These changes have been going on for some time. But it's a question whether the culture shifts or a new culture comes in, and the new generation is bringing different ways of doing things into organizations. By and large, starting up their own organization, where the strategic design, political, and cultural align.
Right. Right. Is there an impact as well that you see from your other questions about sort of different practices for thinking about what the organization is and using consultants and contractors?
Well, consultants have a particular interest in they have considerable power, but particular interest in change, innovation, doing things in new ways, etc., which serves them well. Often is needed, but oftentimes is not needed. And the business environment has gotten, as it's increasingly, there's so many models out, ways of thinking about organizations, designing strategic design principles, and those principles continue to expand and get elaborated. It's still about basic, how do you group, how do you link, and how do you align them? But we've figured out many, many ways to do this.
So oftentimes you're obviously doing this analysis at the level of the organization, but ultimately for all of us, the question is, what
does it mean to me?
What does it mean to me?
Yeah. Well, I think you can click down on into the very unit that you're operating. The little team that I'm with here, 6 people sitting in the room, well, we could analyze the strategic design of this team, what you're trying to get done. We could analyze the power. It might take us a little more time to figure out who's powerful. And there's something about we've learned how to work together. We have certain habits that we don't question. So we could analyze it at that level. We might not be able to do anything about it as we rise up in revolt in the organization, but it's possible, to do it, at the individual level.
And as you've worked with perhaps individuals, either you've met in your research or in our executive education programs, just perhaps as a closing thought, are there any particular highlights or approaches that you've seen people take that you've gone, wow, that's really a powerful application of this idea?
Well, I think the most powerful application I have is that quiet leaders are rewarded. Quiet people who listen, and are savvy about the power dimensions, that the power is not necessarily at the top of the organization, that are gradual, that take the time to learn the culture and work within the culture and not work against it. And that leads to a sort of change strategy that seems to be successful.
Thank you. That's fascinating, and I think we're just about out of time. So sorry if we didn't get to all of your questions. We had over 200 questions asked, but please join me in thanking Professor Van Maanen for this very stimulating and interesting presentation. John is teaching in several upcoming programs. You can see them here on this slide. Also, if you're in the Boston area, I'd like to remind you that coming up we have an open house. You can learn more at executive.mit.edu/open house. And with that, I would just like to finally once again thank John Van Maanen and leave you with his suggested additional reading if you'd like to take a deep dive.
The 3 perspectives.
On the 3 perspectives of managing change. And of course, hopefully you'll be able to come, some of you, and meet us and spend some time with John by attending one of these programs in person at the MIT Sloan School.
We welcome.
Here you'll see some of John's books, but meeting him in person is frankly even better, and I can attest to that personally. So thank you all, thank you John, and goodbye from MIT.
Thanks to all our participants for joining us today. We hope you found this webcast presentation informative. This concludes our webcast. You may now disconnect. Everyone have a good day.